Before there were cities, before there were borders, before even the idea of far away fully existed in the human mind, there was only movement, step by step, across landscapes that offered no maps, no certainty, and no promise of return. Early humans began crossing a world that looked endless. These were not journeys into known places. They were crossings into silence, vast stretches of land where survival depended on reading the wind, the tracks in the soil, the behavior of animals, and the fading memory of those who came before. Some of those paths led into new continents, others ended in disappearance, and some, still, changed what it meant to be human forever. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps support this channel and keeps these long-form journeys into human history alive. Because what follows is not just a story of migration. It is the story of the first time humanity realized that even empty land could be crossed. A cold wind moves across an endless stretch of land where nothing resists it. It travels over gravel plains, through dry riverbeds that have not carried water in years, and across valleys where even sound seems hesitant to exist. There are no roads, no settlements, no smoke rising from distant fires. Only distance, layered upon distance, as if the planet itself is waiting for something that has not yet arrived. In this silence, Earth feels larger than it ever will again. Mountain ranges sit like abandoned walls. Forests gather in isolated clusters, separated by wide gaps of grassland and stone. Rivers carve slow, uncertain paths, sometimes vanishing into soil that swallows them before they can reach the sea. This is not a world shaped by human presence. It is a world that has never needed it. Before the first human journeys begin, there's no sense that the land is empty in the way modern minds imagine emptiness. It is full, but in a different language. Herds move through seasonal routes shaped by instinct older than memory. Predators follow them with patient precision. Birds trace invisible lines across the sky that repeat across generations. Life exists everywhere, but it is distributed unevenly, like scattered notes waiting for a melody that has not been composed. And yet, beneath this surface fullness, something unusual defines this era. There are vast regions where intelligent eyes do not yet look outward with curiosity. No one has stood at the edge of a plateau and wondered what lies beyond the horizon. No one has followed a river just to see where it ends. The land is not unknown in the sense of mystery. It is unknown in the sense of absence. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. If this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy, it helps keep these long, carefully built stories alive, especially those that try to reconstruct worlds that left no written record behind. What makes this ancient world so compelling is not what is present, but what is missing. There are no long-distance travellers moving by intention, no groups crossing entire continents with memory of previous generations guiding them. Even the idea of elsewhere has not yet become a fully formed concept in the human mind. Territory is immediate. Survival is local. Distance is something endured, not explored. Modern archaeology suggests that early humans already possessed the physical and cognitive capacity for a long movement, long before they actually undertook it on a global scale. The bodies were capable. The endurance was there. What remained untested was scale. The transformation from local wandering to continental journeys required more than strength. It required a shift in how the world was mentally mapped. In this pre-journey landscape, even the weather feels different in its predictability. Ice sheets expand and retreat in slow cycles that span thousands of years. Rainfall patterns drift across continents like slow-moving tides. Entire ecological zones migrate without awareness, forcing animals to follow or vanish. Early humans exist within this slow instability, but at first they remain close to the regions where resources are familiar. Africa, in particular, holds a complex mosaic of environments. Savannas stretch wide with shifting boundaries, forests pulse with seasonal change, rivers create corridors of abundance, while deserts expand and contract at the edges. It is here that the earliest human groups form patterns of movement that are still limited in scope short-range shifts, not true long-distance migration. Yet even in this constrained world, something begins to change. Pressure builds quietly, not as a single dramatic event, but as a collection of small environmental nudges. A river shifts course slightly, leaving old hunting grounds drier than before. A drought stretches longer than expected. A herd moves farther than it used to. Each change alone is survivable. Together, they begin to reshape behavior. What is often overlooked is how long these pressures accumulate before any visible migration occurs. Archaeological records suggest that early humans experienced thousands of years of environmental fluctuation before large-scale dispersal events began. During this time, knowledge of the land deepens, but it also becomes fragile, tied to conditions that are slowly dissolving. At some point, the edge of familiarity begins to lose its reliability. The land just beyond known territories is not imagined as foreign in a cultural sense. It is simply untested. No stories define it. No memory anchors it. And yet, survival increasingly depends on looking beyond what is immediately available. The first human journeys across empty lands do not begin with intention in the modern sense. They begin with necessity layered over curiosity, though curiosity at this stage is subtle, almost indistinguishable from instinct. A group moves not because it wants to explore, but because staying becomes slightly less viable than moving. In this early world, even small movements carry enormous weight. A migration of a few dozen kilometers can place a group into an entirely different ecological system. New predators appear, familiar plants disappear, water behaves differently. The land is not empty, but it is unlearned, and unlearning the world is always more dangerous than learning it for the first time. And so, before any grand dispersal across continents, there is this quiet stage of tension. Humans stand at the threshold of landscapes that stretch beyond inherited memory. The world is already fully formed, already vast, already alive in complex balance. What has not yet emerged is the species willing to cross it without certainty of return. Somewhere in this silent expanse, the first true hesitation before distance begins to form. Not fear exactly, and not confidence either, but something more ambiguous. A recognition that the world extends further than experience can easily hold, and once that recognition settles, even lightly, the idea of movement changes forever. The lands remain still, waiting. Nothing announces what is about to begin, but beneath this stillness, the conditions for everything that follows are already in place. In the regions where early humans first emerge, movement is not yet a statement against distance. It is a response to rhythm. Bodies follow food, water, and the shifting pulse of seasons without imagining that they're part of anything larger than survival. Yet beneath this apparent simplicity, something more unusual is taking shape. The human mind is beginning to treat space not only as something to occupy, but something that can be remembered. Across hundreds of thousands of years, the lineage that leads to Homo sapiens develops in landscapes that demand constant adjustment. Africa is not a stable cradle in the romantic sense often imagined later, but a continent of contrast so sharp that survival itself becomes a lesson in flexibility. Wet regions expand into dry ones, forest edges retreat and return, lakes appear and vanish over geological time. In this instability, groups that survive are those capable of tracking change rather than resisting it. Archaeological and paleoanthropological evidence suggests that early Homo sapiens did not begin as deliberate long-distance travellers. Instead, they existed as highly mobile foragers within relatively defined territories. These territories were not borders in the modern sense, but familiar ecological zones shaped by learned knowledge where certain plants grow after rain, where animals pass during dry seasons, where stones suitable for tools can be found. What distinguishes this species gradually is not a sudden leap in intelligence, but a slow expansion in cognitive mapping. The brain begins to store landscapes not just as immediate environments, but as sequences. A river is no longer only where water is found today, but where it has been found before and where it might return. A valley is not just a place of passage, but part of a broader pattern of movement. This shift may seem subtle, but it carries profound consequences. Once space becomes mentally mapped over time, movement becomes less reactive and more anticipatory. A group can leave not because resources have already failed, but because they recognize the early signs that failure is approaching. This kind of foresight does not require abstract planning in the modern sense, but it represents a crucial step away from purely present-bound existence. The origins of this behavioral flexibility are still debated. Some researchers emphasize environmental pressures as the primary driver, pointing to repeated climate fluctuations during the Middle and Late Pleistocene. Others suggest that social complexity plays an equally important role. Larger groups require more sophisticated communication, shared memory, and coordination, all of which reinforce the ability to conceptualize movement across space. What is clear is that by roughly 300,000 to 200,000 years ago, early Homo sapiens are already engaging in movements that exceed the strict boundaries of localized foraging. These are not yet continental migrations, but they begin to stretch the definition of home range in ways that earlier hominin species rarely exhibited. Tool materials, for example, sometimes originate from sources located dozens or even over 100 kilometers away, implying either direct travel or complex exchange networks. One particularly revealing detail comes from stone tool assemblages. Certain techniques and styles appear across wide geographic areas, suggesting not just movement of people, but movement of ideas. Knowledge itself begins to travel, carried in the hands and memories of individuals who move between groups. This is not migration in the grand sense yet, but it is the foundation of it, the ability for human presence to leave traces beyond immediate survival zones. Still, for most of this deep past, movement remains constrained. Energy expenditure is costly. Risk is high. Unknown regions carry uncertainties that cannot be easily resolved through experience alone. Predators differ across habitats. Plants that are edible in one region may be toxic in another. Even subtle differences in terrain can determine whether travel becomes safe passage or fatal miscalculation. In this context, staying put is often the safer strategy, and yet, stability is never guaranteed. Populations grow and shrink. Local resources fluctuate. A successful hunting season can lead to temporary abundance that attracts competition. A poor season can push groups outward simply to maintain equilibrium. These oscillations create a slow, irregular pressure toward movement that does not yet resemble exploration, but begins to prepare the cognitive framework for it. What is especially striking is how much of this early mobility likely occurred without any conceptual separation between known and unknown land. Modern distinctions between familiar territory and foreign space are imposed retrospectively. For early humans, the world is continuous, even if only partially experienced. Beyond each ridge or valley lies not mystery in the philosophical sense, but simply unvisited continuity. And yet, over generations, accumulated experience begins to change this perception. Stories form, not as structured history, but as practical memory where danger was encountered, where food was abundant, where water disappeared unexpectedly. These fragments of shared knowledge gradually shape group decisions. Movement begins to follow not only immediate need, but remembered outcomes. By the time environmental pressures intensify during later climatic cycles, this cognitive foundation is already in place. Humans are no longer purely reactive beings bound to immediate surroundings. They are starting to carry landscapes inside their minds. And once a landscape can be carried mentally, it no longer strictly limits physical movement. Still, even with this emerging adaptability, there is no evidence of intentional expansion into entirely unknown continents at this stage. The boundaries of Africa, though porous, remain largely intact. The real transformation is not outward yet, but inward. It is the slow construction of a mind capable of imagining distance as something traversable rather than merely endured. Within this quiet transformation lies the seed of everything that will follow. The first human journeys across empty lands will not begin with maps or destinations, but with this growing internal model of space imperfect, fragmented, and constantly revised through experience. It is a model built not in certainty, but in adjustment, shaped by every step taken slightly farther than before. And as this mental architecture expands, the world outside remains unchanged in appearance, but increasingly different in meaning. The same valley that once marked the edge of familiarity begins to feel like a threshold rather than a boundary. The same horizon that once ended thought begins to invite it. Without announcement or clear turning point, the conditions for movement beyond inherited space are quietly assembling. There are moments in Earth's long climate history when change does not arrive as a single rupture, but as a slow instability that reshapes everything it touches. For early humans, these are not eras defined by awareness of global systems, but by local disruptions that repeat just often enough to alter behavior. A season that fails to follow its usual pattern. A dry corridor that remains dry longer than memory expects. A river that shifts just far enough to abandon familiar gathering grounds. None of these events are catastrophic on their own, yet together they begin to erode the assumption that the world will remain predictable. During the Middle and Late Pleistocene, climatic oscillations become one of the most powerful invisible forces shaping human movement. Ice sheets expand and retreat across the northern hemisphere, but their influence extends far beyond their physical boundaries. Atmospheric circulation changes rainfall patterns across Africa and Eurasia. Monsoon systems intensify and weaken over millennia. Deserts expand into regions that were once grasslands, then retreat again, as if the planet is breathing on a scale too slow for any single lifetime to perceive. For early Homo sapiens, this creates a world where environmental memory becomes unreliable. A place that was resource-rich in one generation may become marginal in the next. Lakes that supported large game animals can shrink into salt flats. Forest edges can retreat by hundreds of kilometers over centuries. Even river systems, often considered stable anchors of survival, begin to shift course in ways that force repeated adjustments in human settlement patterns. What is especially important is not any single climatic event, but the repetition of change itself. Stability is no longer the default condition. Instead, it becomes something that must be actively tracked, inferred, and sometimes abandoned. Archaeological evidence from multiple African sites suggests that human groups respond to these shifts not with sudden mass migrations, but with a pattern of incremental relocation, small movements that maintain access to resources while avoiding complete ecological collapse. This gradual mobility has profound consequences. It means that by the time larger dispersals occur, humans are already accustomed to the idea that place is temporary. The concept of a fixed homeland begins to soften, not disappear, but loosen. Survival increasingly depends on recognizing early signs of environmental decline rather than reacting to its final stages. One of the lesser known but significant aspects of this period is the role of ecological corridors. During wetter phases, regions such as the Sahara are not the barren deserts they are today. Instead, they transform into grasslands and savannas, punctuated by lakes and seasonal rivers. These green corridors periodically connect Africa with the Levant and other adjacent regions, creating transient pathways that later disappear under arid conditions. For early humans, these shifting corridors act like brief invitations, openings in the landscape that exist only for limited windows of time. Yet even when these corridors are open, movement is not guaranteed. The decision to follow them requires more than opportunity. It requires accumulated pressure, both environmental and social. Groups must weigh the risks of leaving known territories against the uncertain benefits of what lies beyond. In many cases, populations remain within familiar zones, even as conditions slowly deteriorate, adapting through technological and behavioral changes rather than relocation. Stone tool evidence from various African sites shows increasing refinement during periods of environmental stress. More efficient hunting technologies emerge, broader diets are exploited, resource processing becomes more sophisticated. These adaptations suggest that early humans often respond to climate instability first, by intensifying local exploitation rather than abandoning territory altogether. Movement is not the first solution. It is one of several strategies, often considered only when others begin to fail. Still, climate pressure accumulates over long timescales. In some regions, particularly during prolonged arid phases, local adaptation reaches its limits. Water sources become too unreliable. Game animals migrate beyond reachable distances. Vegetation patterns shift in ways that no longer support traditional subsistence strategies. At this point, remaining in place becomes increasingly difficult, and mobility shifts from optional adjustment to necessary survival response. What makes this transition especially complex is that it does not occur uniformly across populations. Some groups move earlier, following emerging ecological gradients. Others remain longer, exploiting residual resources or relying on knowledge of microenvironments that temporarily sustain life. This uneven response creates a mosaic of movement patterns across the continent, with no single direction or unified migration event at this stage. There is also evidence that climatic stress may have influenced social organization itself. Smaller, more flexible group structures tend to have advantages in unstable environments. Large groups require more stable resource bases, while smaller groups can disperse, recombine, and adjust more quickly to changing conditions. This flexibility may have contributed to the behavioral versatility that later characterizes successful long-distance migrations. It is important to emphasize that none of this represents a linear push toward expansion beyond Africa. Instead, it is a long period of adaptive oscillation, where humans move within fluctuating boundaries defined by shifting climates. The idea of leaving a continent entirely is not yet a distinct behavioral category. Movement remains regional, even when distances are substantial by modern standards. However, within this prolonged instability, something essential is being forged. Humans are learning, over thousands of generations, that survival is not tied to a single place. It is tied to the ability to read change, to anticipate loss, and to move before collapse becomes irreversible. This is not yet exploration, it is preparation for it. As climates continue their slow oscillations, the landscape itself becomes a kind of teacher. It does not announce lessons, it simply alters conditions until behavior adjusts. Rivers teach flexibility by changing course. Deserts teach patience by expanding and retreating. Forests teach timing by appearing and disappearing in cycles that outlast any individual life. By the end of this long climatic rhythm, early humans are no longer the same kind of inhabitants they once were. They are not yet global travelers, but they are no longer stationary beings either. They exist in a state of learned impermanence, shaped by landscapes that refuse to remain still. And within this state, the possibility of crossing beyond known regions begins to exist not as imagination, but as a practical extension of lived experience. There was a time when the edges of the world were not marked by oceans or mountains in the human mind, but by familiarity thinning into uncertainty, a river bend that no longer looked the same after a flood, a stretch of grassland where game animals arrived later than expected, a ridge where wind patterns changed enough to alter the sound of approaching herds. These were the subtle signals that the landscape was shifting into something less predictable, even when it still looked unchanged to the eye. Across long stretches of the Pleistocene, the Earth repeatedly reorganizes its surface conditions through cycles of cooling and warming. Ice advances in the north, locking away vast quantities of water, while tropical and subtropical zones respond with shifts in rainfall and vegetation. What emerges is not a stable map, but a constantly redrawn one. Forests migrate slowly across continents. Grasslands expand, then retreat. Arid zones grow and contract like breathing organisms. For early humans, these changes do not present themselves as abstract climate systems. They are experienced as direct transformations of survival space. A hunting ground becomes unreliable. A water source becomes seasonal instead of permanent. A familiar migration route of animals shifts far enough that following it requires rethinking the distance between resources. In this world, stability is not a given condition of geography. It is a temporary alignment between life and environment. One of the most significant outcomes of these oscillations is the periodic creation of what might be called green corridors. During wetter phases, regions that are now desert become traversable landscapes of grass, lakes, and scattered woodland. The Sahara, for example, transforms multiple times over tens of thousands of years from an arid barrier into a mosaic of habitable environments. Rivers flow where today there is only sand. Large lakes form in basins that are now dry depressions. Animals move through these regions, and where animals move, human groups can follow. These corridors do not remain open indefinitely. They appear and disappear on timescales that are long in human terms but short in geological perspective. A landscape that supports movement for several thousand years can become impassable within a few generations. This creates a unique dynamic. Opportunities for expansion exist, but they are transient. Access to new regions is not constant, but episodic. What makes this especially important is how early humans respond to these temporary openings. There is no evidence of coordinated continent-spanning migration plans. Instead, movement appears to follow ecological opportunity and local decision-making. Small groups expand into newly viable zones, often without awareness of the broader scale of what is happening. Over time, these incremental movements accumulate into larger dispersals, but at the moment of action, each step is local, immediate, and pragmatic. Alongside these environmental changes, the physical geography of movement itself becomes increasingly structured by natural pathways. River systems act as corridors through otherwise difficult terrain. Coastlines provide continuous access to marine resources and predictable routes. Elevation gradients determine where vegetation changes abruptly, creating natural boundaries that both constrain and guide movement. Early humans do not need maps to follow these structures. The landscape itself organizes travel possibilities. Archaeological findings from multiple regions suggest that these routes are not random. Stone tool distributions, genetic patterns, and ancient settlement sites often align along predictable ecological corridors. This indicates that early movement was not chaotic wandering, but patterned expansion shaped by environmental logic. Even without formal navigation systems, humans are responding to structured signals embedded in the land. Yet even within these structured pathways, uncertainty remains constant. A corridor that appears open may contain hidden risks, water sources that dry unexpectedly, predators that concentrate in narrow passages, or resource patches that fail to regenerate. Movement is always a negotiation between opportunity and risk, and the balance shifts continuously. One lesser discussed aspect of this period is the role of ecological memory. Early human groups likely carried detailed knowledge of seasonal changes, animal behavior, and landscape features across generations. This knowledge was not stored in written form, but in shared experience, storytelling, and repeated practice. Such memory systems allowed groups to anticipate changes in familiar regions, but they were far less effective in unfamiliar territories. This limitation becomes crucial when groups begin to move into newly accessible corridors. As humans enter these shifting landscapes, they encounter environments that do not match inherited expectations. Plants behave differently. Animal migration patterns are unfamiliar. Even the timing of seasons may differ slightly from known regions. These discrepancies force rapid learning and adaptation. Survival depends not only on physical endurance, but on cognitive flexibility, the ability to update internal models of the world in real time. Over thousands of years, this process gradually builds a new relationship between humans and geography. Land is no longer just a stable stage for survival. It becomes a dynamic system that must be continuously interpreted. Movement is no longer simply following resources. It becomes a form of environmental reading. By the time these cycles of wet and dry phases have repeated many times, early humans are no longer confined to a single ecological identity. They are becoming adaptable occupants of multiple environments, capable of shifting between forests, savannas, and semi-arid regions depending on conditions. This adaptability is not yet global in scope, but it is foundational. It prepares the species for movement beyond any single environmental zone, and as the land continues to reshape itself in slow, rhythmic transformations, the idea of crossing into entirely new regions begins to emerge not as a rupture, but as a continuation of what has already been happening for thousands of years, gradual adjustment to a world that never remains the same for long. There is a point in human development where movement stops being only a reaction to pressure and begins to require something more subtle, an internal model of space that can exist independently of immediate experience. This does not appear suddenly. It forms slowly, through repeated exposure to landscapes that demand attention, memory, and prediction. Long before maps, long before symbols, there is the growing ability to hold a mental image of distance. In early human groups, navigation is not a separate skill. It is woven into survival itself. Every return to a water source, every seasonal tracking of animal herds, every recollection of where certain stones produce sharper tools contributes to a layered understanding of the environment. Over time, these fragments form a cognitive structure that links place to time. A river is not only a location, it is a sequence of conditions that change across seasons. A valley is not just terrain. It is a pattern of recurring opportunity and risk. This emerging spatial awareness allows early humans to move with increasing confidence beyond immediately visible territory. Even without abstract maps, they begin to anticipate what lies beyond the next ridge based on accumulated experience. The mind starts to extend the body beyond its sensory limits. This is one of the quiet turning points in human evolution, not marked by a single discovery, but by the gradual refinement of memory as a spatial tool. One of the most important developments supporting this shift is the increasing complexity of social learning. Knowledge about the landscape is no longer confined to individual experience. It is shared, repeated, corrected, and preserved across generations. A single successful journey becomes collective memory. A dangerous route becomes a warning passed through stories and behavioral cues. Over time, this shared knowledge forms a distributed navigation system that allows groups to move more safely and more efficiently. At the same time, early humans are refining their ability to interpret environmental signals. The direction of wind patterns, the behavior of birds, the movement of clouds, and the condition of vegetation all become part of a constantly updated reading of the world. None of these elements are understood scientifically, but they are observed with increasing precision. The land becomes readable in an intuitive sense, even if its underlying causes remain unknown. Archaeological evidence supports the idea that early humans were capable of relatively long-distance movement within familiar ecological zones. Tool materials sourced from distant locations show that travel or exchange networks could extend over significant distances. However, what distinguishes this period is not just distance, but the consistency of movement patterns. Humans are not simply wandering farther. They are moving along recognizable routes that are reused and refined over time. These routes are shaped by environmental constraints. River valleys provide continuous access to water and game. Coastal areas offer predictable resources and easier navigation. Grassland corridors allow visibility over long distances, reducing the risk of ambush and making travel more manageable. Even without formal planning, these features structure movement in ways that gradually turn irregular wandering into patterned mobility. Yet despite this growing sophistication, movement remains fundamentally local in its logic. Groups do not yet conceptualize vast unknown regions as destinations. Instead, they extend familiar patterns incrementally. Each journey builds slightly on the previous one. The unknown is approached indirectly through gradual expansion of the known. There is also an important psychological dimension to this process. Early humans likely experienced unfamiliar terrain not as abstract foreignness, but as practical uncertainty. The land beyond known routes is not imagined as empty or symbolic. It is simply untested. This distinction matters because it shapes how risk is perceived. Unknown space is not inherently feared. It is evaluated based on whether survival strategies can be applied within it. Over time, Repeated exposure to environmental variation reduces the boundary between known and unknown. As groups move across different ecological zones, they begin to recognize patterns that repeat in different forms. A river in one region behaves differently in detail, but similarly in function to rivers elsewhere. A forest edge in one climate zone may resemble a savanna transition in another. These recognitions allow for a form of transferable knowledge experience that can be applied across landscapes. This adaptability becomes especially important during periods of environmental instability. When climate shifts force changes in resource distribution, groups capable of reinterpreting new environments quickly have a significant advantage. Those unable to adapt either remain constrained in shrinking habitats or fail to follow shifting ecological opportunities. What emerges from this long process is not a sudden invention of navigation, but a gradual deepening of spatial intelligence. Humans begin to inhabit a world that is no longer limited to what is immediately present. They carry extended geographies in their memory, shaped by both direct experience and collective knowledge. Movement becomes less about reaction and more about informed anticipation. Still, even with this cognitive expansion, there remains a threshold that has not yet been crossed. The world is understood in segments, not as a continuous whole. Movement occurs between known nodes rather than across fully conceptualized space. The idea of traversing vast empty regions without prior knowledge of what lies ahead is still outside regular experience. But the foundations for that possibility are now in place. Memory can hold distance. Experience can be shared. Environmental signals can be interpreted with increasing sophistication. And most importantly, movement is no longer confined to immediate necessity alone. Within this evolving framework, the first steps toward journeys across truly unfamiliar and expansive landscapes become not only possible, but increasingly inevitable. At some point in the long rhythm of human movement, the boundary between staying and leaving begins to blur into something less decisive than it appears in hindsight. There is no moment when early humans suddenly decide to abandon familiar lands for distant horizons. Instead, there are a gradual stretching of routine paths, an accumulation of small extensions beyond the edges of what previous generations would have considered enough. The earliest movements beyond Africa and within surrounding regions are not grand migrations in the modern imagination. They are expansions along ecological gradients, following water, vegetation, and animal herds as they shift across time. The land does not present itself as a series of continents separated by conceptual borders. It presents itself as a continuous surface of opportunity and risk, structured by rivers, coastlines, and seasonal cycles. One of the most significant pathways for early expansion is the Levantine Corridor. This narrow but ecologically rich region acts as a bridge between Africa and Eurasia. During favourable climatic phases, it supports a mosaic of habitats, woodlands, grasslands, and river valleys that allow both human and animal movement. Archaeological sites in this region reveal repeated episodes of occupation and abandonment, reflecting the unstable climate conditions that govern access. Early humans moving through such corridors do not experience them as gateways to a new world. Instead, they are extensions of familiar environments, slightly altered, but still navigable using known strategies. The real transformation occurs gradually, as groups move farther from the ecological conditions they were adapted to and encounter environments that require new forms of behaviour. In these early dispersals, rivers play an essential role. They're not only sources of water but also natural guides through unfamiliar terrain. Following a river system provides continuity in an otherwise variable landscape. It reduces uncertainty. offering predictable access to resources and a consistent directional structure. For early human groups, rivers become both lifelines and pathways, shaping the direction of movement in ways that are often invisible in the archaeological record but evident in settlement patterns. Coastal routes also begin to emerge as important pathways. The edges of continents offer stable access to marine resources, including shellfish, fish, and coastal vegetation. These environments can support relatively dense populations, even when inland regions become unstable. Movement along coastlines allows groups to travel without crossing large, resource-scarce interiors. This form of mobility is especially important during periods when inland climates become more unpredictable. Despite these advantages, early expansion is still highly constrained. Movement beyond familiar zones involves significant uncertainty. New regions may contain unfamiliar predators, different plant toxicity profiles, or altered seasonal cycles. Even subtle changes in daylight patterns or rainfall timing can affect survival strategies that worked in previous environments. As a result, early human dispersals tend to be cautious, incremental, and often reversible. Evidence from stone tool industries suggests that cultural adaptation accompanies these movements. Tool traditions change gradually as groups encounter new materials and new ecological demands. Some technologies spread widely across regions, while others remain localized. This mixture of continuity and variation reflects both the connectivity and fragmentation of early human populations as they move through expanding territories. One of the lesser-known but important aspects of this period is the role of demographic pressure. Population growth within stable regions can lead to gradual outward expansion, not as a coordinated migration, but as a slow diffusion of groups seeking new resource zones. This process does not require collapse or crisis. It can occur simply as a byproduct of successful adaptation within a region reaching its ecological limits. At the same time, climate fluctuations continue to shape opportunities for movement. During wetter phases, corridors open that allow passage into regions that would otherwise be impassable. During drier phases, populations contract back into refugia areas where water and resources remain reliable. This repeated expansion and contraction creates a dynamic pattern of movement that gradually spreads human presence across wider geographic areas. What is especially important is that these movements begin to accumulate over time. Each generation inherits a slightly broader mental map of the world. Even if individuals do not travel far, knowledge of distant regions gradually becomes part of collective awareness. This does not mean full understanding of those regions, but rather the recognition that life exists beyond immediate surroundings in ways that can be reached under certain conditions. As groups move farther from their points of origin, they also begin to encounter increasingly diverse environments. Forests give way to open grasslands. Arid zones transition into steppe-like landscapes. Seasonal extremes become more pronounced. Each of these transitions requires adjustment, but also expands the range of human adaptability. Over time, this adaptability becomes one of the defining characteristics of the species. Importantly, there is still no evidence of a single, unified migration event during this stage. Instead, what emerges is a pattern of repeated dispersals, pauses, and local extinctions, followed by re-expansion. Human presence spreads unevenly, leaving gaps and clusters rather than continuous occupation. This fragmented expansion reflects both environmental constraints and the gradual nature of adaptation. And yet, despite its slow pace, this process marks a fundamental shift. For the first time, human groups are consistently moving beyond the ecological boundaries of their origin zones. They're no longer confined to a single continental system. They're beginning to occupy multiple regions, each with distinct environmental challenges. Within this unfolding process, the idea of distance itself begins to change. It is no longer defined solely by effort or risk, but by accumulated experience. What was once unknown becomes reachable through repeated steps, and what is reachable begins to reshape what is considered possible. The first human journeys across empty lands are no longer a distant possibility. They are already underway, unfolding quietly across landscapes that still appear vast and unbroken. There is a threshold in early human movement where survival stops being guaranteed by familiarity and begins to depend on adaptability alone. It is not marked by a single catastrophe, but by a growing recognition that every environment eventually changes its terms. Food sources shift, water becomes seasonal, and once reliable routes begin to require recalibration. In this unstable balance, the edge of scarcity becomes a constant companion. As early human groups move into new regions beyond their ancestral ecological zones, they encounter a fundamental challenge. The rules that governed survival in one landscape do not always apply in another. A hunting strategy effective in African savannas may fail in Eurasian forests. Plants that are edible in one region may have no nutritional equivalent elsewhere. Even the behavior of animals changes in ways that require rapid learning rather than inherited knowledge. This is where survival becomes less about possession and more about interpretation. Every new landscape must be read in real time. The position of water sources, the seasonal movement of herds, the availability of edible plants, and the presence of predators must all be reassessed from the beginning. There is no longer a stable baseline of certainty. Each environment demands its own logic. Archaeological evidence suggests that early human dispersals were often accompanied by shifts in subsistence strategies. Groups that had previously relied heavily on a narrow range of resources begin to diversify their diets. This includes increased use of small game, aquatic resources, plant tubers, and opportunistic scavenging. Such flexibility is not a luxury. It becomes essential for survival in unfamiliar ecological systems. In these new environments, the margin between abundance and collapse can be extremely thin. A seasonal delay in rainfall may reduce plant availability just enough to force relocation. A change in predator distribution may make certain valleys temporarily unsafe. Even minor fluctuations in temperature or vegetation density can alter the viability of a region for human occupation. What makes this period particularly significant is that humans are no longer simply moving through familiar territory with predictable variations. They're entering landscapes where prior experience offers only partial guidance. The knowledge carried from previous regions must be constantly adjusted, tested, and sometimes abandoned. This creates a continuous cycle of learning under pressure. One of the most important survival strategies that emerges during this time is risk buffering through mobility. Instead of relying on a single resource zone, groups begin to spread their activity across multiple ecological niches. Seasonal movement becomes more structured, even if still informal. In some cases, groups may alternate between river valleys in wet seasons and higher ground during dry periods, maximizing access to different resource systems. However, mobility itself carries costs. Movement requires energy, coordination, and knowledge of terrain. It also introduces uncertainty at every transition point. The decision to leave a partially stable environment is never purely mechanical. It involves weighing immediate security against the possibility of future failure. In environments where resources are already marginal, this balance becomes increasingly delicate. There is also evidence that technological adaptation intensifies during periods of ecological stress. Toolkits become more versatile, allowing for a wider range of tasks. Hunting strategies diversify, and evidence of more complex butchering techniques appears in some archaeological contexts. Fire use, where available, becomes increasingly important not only for cooking but also for warmth, protection, and landscape management. Despite these innovations, survival remains precarious in many regions. Small population sizes during early dispersals mean that local extinctions are possible if conditions deteriorate beyond a certain threshold. A drought lasting several years, a sudden collapse in game populations, or a shift in vegetation zones can be enough to force abandonment of entire areas. These losses are not always permanent, as later re-expansion may occur, but they highlight the fragility of early occupation outside core regions. What is particularly striking is how often survival depends on knowledge that cannot be fully verified in advance. Groups must rely on memory, inference, and observation to predict conditions in regions they have not recently visited. This creates a constant tension between experience and uncertainty. The landscape is no longer a stable backdrop. It is an active variable in decision-making. Over time, groups that survive these challenges develop increasingly sophisticated ways of reading environmental signals. Subtle changes in vegetation can indicate deeper water sources. Animal movement patterns can suggest seasonal transitions. Wind direction and cloud formation become part of an informal predictive system. None of this constitutes formal science, but it represents a growing ecological intelligence embedded in lived experience. In some regions, especially those at the edges of expanding human presence, survival becomes a matter of timing. Arriving too early in a newly favorable region may mean encountering insufficient resources. Arriving too late may mean facing competition or environmental decline. This temporal sensitivity adds another layer of complexity to movement decisions. As humans continue to expand into new territories, the experience of scarcity does not disappear. Instead, it becomes a driving force that shapes behavior at every level. Scarcity is not only about absence, it is about variability, about the unpredictable distribution of resources across space and time. And within this constant negotiation with uncertainty, something profound is taking shape. Humans are learning not only how to survive in different environments, but how to survive across them. The ability to move between zones of abundance and scarcity becomes a defining feature of the species' expanding range. The empty lands they cross are never truly empty. They are filled with conditions that must be interpreted, risks that must be managed, and opportunities that must be recognized quickly. Survival is no longer tied to a single place, but to the ability to continuously adapt as the world shifts around them. There are landscapes on Earth that do not simply separate regions, they test the limits of endurance itself. Vast deserts where heat distorts distance into illusion. Endless steppes where the horizon never seems closer no matter how far one walks. Frozen corridors where silence is so complete it feels almost physical. For early humans moving beyond familiar ecological zones, these were not abstract barriers. They were lived realities that shaped who could continue forward and who would turn back. As human groups gradually expand into broader geographic ranges, they begin to encounter regions where survival is not supported by dense resource distribution, but by careful timing and extreme efficiency. These are the empty regions of the ancient world, not empty in the absolute sense, but empty of predictable abundance. Life exists here, but it is dispersed, seasonal, and often hidden beneath the surface of apparent barrenness. Deserts, in particular, play a crucial role in shaping migration patterns. During certain climatic phases, regions like the Sahara are not the continuous sand seas known today, but still they can oscillate between semi-arid grasslands and harsh desert conditions. Even in more habitable phases, these environments demand a level of ecological knowledge far beyond what is required in river valleys or forest edges. Water is not visible. It must be inferred, remembered, or followed through in direct signs such as animal movement or vegetation patterns. Crossing such regions requires a fundamental shift in strategy. Instead of relying on immediate availability of resources, groups must carry knowledge of where resources might be found at a distance. This transforms movement into a form of calculated risk. Every journey becomes a negotiation between supply, distance, and uncertainty. Unlike riverine or coastal routes, where resources are relatively continuous, desert environments force long stretches without guaranteed access to water or food. Steppes present a different but equally demanding challenge. These vast grassland regions stretch across Eurasia, offering visibility over long distances but also exposing travellers to environmental extremes. Temperatures can shift dramatically between seasons, and even between day and night. While game animals may be abundant, they are highly mobile, requiring constant tracking across open terrain. In such landscapes, survival depends on stamina, observation, and the ability to anticipate movement across large spatial scales. Frozen regions, encountered during later expansions into higher latitudes, introduce yet another dimension of constraint. Here, the primary challenge is not only scarcity of food, but the energetic cost of maintaining body heat. Resources may be seasonally abundant, but access is tightly bound to timing. Ice, snow, and frozen ground transform the landscape into a slow-moving system, where opportunities appear and disappear with seasonal cycles that must be carefully tracked. Across all these environments, one pattern becomes clear. The further humans move from ecological core zones, the more survival depends on knowledge rather than immediate abundance. Physical strength alone is not enough. Neither is simple presence in a territory. What matters is the ability to read subtle environmental cues and translate them into actionable decisions. Archaeological evidence suggests that early human groups developed increasingly sophisticated behavioral adaptations to cope with these conditions. Portable technologies become more important. Lightweight toolkits, adaptable hunting strategies, and flexible social organization allow groups to respond quickly to changing conditions. The ability to relocate efficiently becomes as important as the ability to exploit a given environment. In desert margins, for example, movement often follows rare but reliable indicators such as seasonal waterholes or ancient dry riverbeds that occasionally channel rainfall. In steppe environments, migration routes may align with the movement of herds across vast grasslands. In colder regions, seasonal camps are established to take advantage of predictable resource cycles, even if those resources are available only for short periods each year. What is particularly important is that these strategies are not developed in isolation. They accumulate over generations, refined through repeated exposure to challenging environments. Knowledge of how to cross difficult terrain is preserved not in written records, but in practices, techniques, and shared memory. Failure in one generation can become instruction for the next, embedded in cultural behavior rather than formal documentation. Yet even with increasing adaptation, these empty regions act as filters. Not all groups that attempt to cross them succeed. Some are forced to retreat, others fragment into smaller populations, and some disappear entirely from the archaeological record. These losses are not always visible in detail, but their presence is implied by gaps in settlement continuity, and genetic bottlenecks observed in modern populations. One of the more subtle effects of these challenging landscapes is the reinforcement of mobility as a survival norm. In environments where resources are not reliably stationary, staying in one place becomes less viable over time. Movement is no longer an exceptional response. It becomes an embedded condition of existence. As humans move through these vast regions, their perception of distance also changes. What once seemed like extreme separation between points becomes normalized through repeated traversal. Distances that would be considered vast in earlier contexts become manageable through accumulated experience and improved knowledge of terrain. Still, these journeys are never without cost. Each crossing of an empty region carries risk. Each successful passage reinforces knowledge, but each failure reminds groups of the limits of adaptation. Survival is never guaranteed by skill alone. It depends on timing, environmental variability, and often a degree of uncertainty that cannot be fully controlled. And yet, despite these challenges, humans continue to move outward, not because empty landscapes are easy, but because remaining within constrained ecological zones becomes increasingly difficult as populations grow and environments shift. The empty regions of the world do not simply block expansion, they shape it, directing movement along paths where survival is just barely possible. Within these vast, challenging spaces, the species learns a crucial lesson. Emptiness is not absence. It is a different form of presence, one that demands awareness, patience, and an ability to persist where resources are not immediately visible. And it is through these demanding crossings that human movement begins to take on a planetary scale, even if no one involved could ever perceive it that way at the time. In landscapes where people once moved without leaving written words, the earth itself becomes the archive. Stone tools buried in ancient river terraces, hearths preserved under layers of sediment, animal bones fractured in patterns that reveal hunting strategies long forgotten. Even footprints hardened in mud and later sealed by time can become messages, waiting tens of thousands of years to be read. The story of early human journeys across vast regions is not preserved as a single narrative. It is reconstructed from fragments scattered across continents, each piece offering a limited glimpse into movements that were never planned as history. Archaeology does not show intention, it shows traces, and from those traces, a pattern slowly emerges. One of the most important forms of evidence comes from stone tools. Early humans leave behind lithic technologies that vary in style, technique, and material sourcing. Some stone types are found far from their geological origin, indicating long-distance transport or exchange networks. In other cases, distinctive tool-making methods appear across wide regions, suggesting either population movement or the transmission of knowledge between groups. These patterns are not uniform. They appear in waves, with periods of expansion followed by contraction or regional isolation. This reflects the unstable nature of early human occupation outside core ecological zones. A region may be inhabited for centuries or millennia, then abandoned when environmental conditions shift, only to be reoccupied later under different climatic circumstances. Another crucial line of evidence comes from ancient hearths and habitation sites. These locations provide insight into how early humans structured their time and space. The distribution of burnt material, food remains, and tool fragments allows researchers to reconstruct activity patterns. In some sites, repeated seasonal occupation is evident, suggesting that groups return to specific locations as part of cyclical movement strategies. Footprints preserved in sediment offer some of the most direct and intimate evidence of early journeys. Unlike tools or bones, footprints capture a moment in motion. They reveal group composition, direction of travel, and sometimes even interactions between adults and children. In a few extraordinary cases, multiple sets of footprints show groups moving together across ancient landscapes, leaving behind a brief but powerful record of coordinated movement. Genetic evidence adds another dimension to this reconstruction. Modern human populations carry signatures of ancient bottlenecks and expansions that reflect past migrations. Certain genetic lineages trace back to small founding populations that spread across large regions. These patterns align with archaeological evidence of repeated dispersals and population fragmentation during periods of environmental stress. However, interpreting these traces is not straightforward. The archaeological record is incomplete, shaped by preservation bias, erosion, and the uneven survival of material remains. Entire episodes of migration may leave little to no direct evidence, especially if groups used perishable materials or occupied regions where conditions did not favor long-term preservation. Even so, when multiple lines of evidence are combined, a broader picture emerges. Human movement across ancient landscapes was neither random nor linear. It followed environmental corridors, responded to climatic cycles, and adapted to shifting resource distributions. The result is a complex web of occupation, abandonment, and reoccupation that spans continents and tens of thousands of years. One particularly revealing aspect of this record is the relationship between technology and movement. Changes in tool-making traditions often coincide with shifts in geographic distribution. In some cases, new techniques appear shortly after humans enter new environments, suggesting rapid adaptation. In others, older methods persist even in unfamiliar settings, indicating cultural continuity despite environmental change. This interplay between stability and adaptation is central to understanding early journeys. Movement does not erase tradition. Instead, it transforms it. Techniques are modified to suit new materials and conditions, but underlying principles often remain recognizable across vast distances. This continuity suggests that migration was not simply physical relocation, but also a process of cultural transmission. At the same time, the archaeological record reveals gaps regions where human presence appears to vanish for long periods. These absences may reflect real population declines or simply the limits of preservation. In some cases, environmental conditions likely made certain areas temporarily uninhabitable. In others, groups may have shifted to regions that have yet to be fully explored archaeologically. What is striking is how these gaps and connections together form a pattern of intermittent occupation across vast spaces. Human presence expands, contracts, and reappears in ways that mirror environmental fluctuations. This reinforces the idea that early journeys were deeply tied to ecological rhythms rather than fixed expansionist trajectories. There are also subtle indications of interaction between distant groups. Similar tool types found in separated regions raise the possibility of indirect contact or shared ancestry from earlier dispersal events. While direct evidence of long-distance interaction is rare, the distribution of certain cultural traits suggests that human networks may have extended farther than previously assumed, even if only intermittently. Ultimately, the archaeological record does not provide a continuous narrative of migration. Instead, it offers a mosaic of evidence that must be assembled carefully. Each site represents a fragment of a much larger process, one that unfolded over immense spans of time and across landscapes that have since changed dramatically. And within this mosaic, one conclusion becomes increasingly clear. Early human journeys across empty lands were not singular events, but repeated acts of movement and adjustment. Each trace left behind is a reminder that expansion was not a straight line, but a slow accumulation of decisions made under changing conditions. The Earth holds these traces quietly. Stone, bone, and soil preserve them not as stories, but as evidence waiting to be interpreted. And from that evidence, the outline of movement begins to take shape, imperfect, fragmented, but undeniably present. Deep in the genetic record of modern humans lies a kind of hidden geography, one that does not map mountains or rivers, but population size, separation, and survival. It is a map drawn in inherited fragments of DNA, where entire chapters of ancient movement are compressed into patterns of variation that can still be read today. And within this record, one theme appears again and again: expansion is never smooth. It is interrupted by narrowing, by loss, and by moments when survival depends on a very small number of individuals. As early humans move beyond their original ecological zones, they do not spread evenly across the world. Instead, they pass through bottlenecks, periods where populations shrink dramatically before expanding again. These bottlenecks are not always caused by a single catastrophic event. They can result from prolonged droughts, resource fragmentation, isolation of groups in marginal environments, or simply the cumulative difficulty of surviving in unfamiliar landscapes. What makes these bottlenecks so important is not only their immediate impact, but their long-term consequences. When population size becomes small, genetic diversity decreases. This means that future generations carry only a fraction of the variation that existed before the bottleneck. In a sense, entire branches of human history are narrowed into a smaller stream, shaping the biological foundation of all later populations. Yet despite these constraints, humans repeatedly recover and expand. After each contraction, there is often a renewed phase of dispersal. Groups move outward again, sometimes into regions that were previously unoccupied or abandoned. This pattern of contraction and expansion suggests that early human movement is not a single continuous wave, but a series of pulses driven by environmental opportunity and survival pressure. One of the most significant bottleneck events in human prehistory is associated with the broader dispersal of Homo sapiens out of Africa. Genetic evidence suggests that all non-African populations today may descend from a relatively small group of individuals who left the continent tens of thousands of years ago. The exact size of this founding population remains debated, but what is clear is that it represents a dramatic narrowing of genetic diversity compared to African populations. This does not mean that only one migration occurred. Rather, it suggests that only certain waves of migration were successful in leaving lasting genetic descendants. Other dispersals may have occurred earlier or simultaneously, but failed to establish long-term populations. The archaeological and genetic records together imply a complex process of repeated movement, local extinction, and eventual consolidation. In the environments beyond Africa, early human groups encounter new pressures that intensify the effects of small population size. Isolation becomes more pronounced as groups spread across vast and varied landscapes. In some regions, populations may remain separated for thousands of years, developing distinct cultural and genetic characteristics. In others, intermittent contact may reintroduce genetic diversity, partially reversing the effects of isolation. These dynamics are especially visible in regions such as Eurasia, where multiple waves of human expansion intersect with changing climates and landscapes. Some populations expand rapidly during favorable climatic windows, only to contract or disappear during subsequent environmental shifts. Others persist in refugial areas, maintaining continuity through periods of instability. What emerges from this pattern is not a steady global spread, but a patchwork of survival. Human populations are repeatedly tested by the limits of their environment. Some groups adapt successfully and expand, others vanish from certain regions, leaving behind only traces in archaeological layers and genetic signals in later populations. An important aspect of this process is the role of founder effects. When small groups establish new populations in previously unoccupied regions, the genetic composition of those populations reflects only a subset of the original diversity. Over time, this leads to differentiation between groups that share a common origin but have been separated by geography and time. These differences are not signs of isolation alone, but of repeated cycles of expansion from small founding populations. Despite the challenges posed by bottlenecks and isolation, humans demonstrate a remarkable capacity for recovery. Cultural innovation plays a crucial role in this resilience. New tools, new strategies for resource use, and new forms of social organization allow populations to survive in environments that would otherwise be marginal. In some cases, technological adaptation may even compensate for reduced population size by increasing efficiency in resource exploitation. Another key factor is mobility itself. The ability to move across landscapes allows small populations to reconnect, merge, or shift into more favorable environments. This mobility reduces the long-term risk of complete isolation, even when short-term separation is significant. Over time, this creates a dynamic equilibrium between separation and reconnection, shaping both genetic and cultural diversity. It is important to emphasize that these bottlenecks are not signs of failure. They are inherent to the process of expansion into new and challenging environments. Each narrowing of population size is followed by periods of growth and diversification. In this sense, restriction becomes part of the mechanism of spread rather than its opposite. As humans continue to move across continents, the interplay between small group survival and large-scale expansion becomes one of the defining features of their history. Every successful dispersal carries within it the memory of near loss. Every population contains traces of past contractions that shaped its present form. And beneath all of this lies a deeper implication. The journey across empty lands was never just a matter of covering distance. It was also a matter of surviving the invisible pressures that distance creates genetic, ecological, and social. Expansion and limitation are not separate processes. They are intertwined phases of the same long unfolding movement. In this way, the genetic record does more than describe ancestry. It reveals the hidden cost of becoming a global species, a cost measured not only in miles crossed, but in lives narrowed, reduced, and then rebuilt across time. There is a point in the spread of early humans across Eurasia where the landscape is no longer populated by a single kind of human presence. Instead, multiple lineages overlap in time, sharing space in ways that are only partially understood through archaeological fragments and genetic echoes. The world is not yet fully modern in its human composition. It is a mosaic of closely related species and populations, each adapted to different environments, each carrying its own history of survival. As Homo sapiens expands beyond Africa, they do not enter an empty continent. They enter a world already inhabited by other human relatives. Neanderthals occupy much of Europe and parts of Western Asia, adapted to colder climates and structured hunting of large game. Denisovans, known primarily through genetic evidence and sparse fossil remains, appear to have occupied broad regions of Asia, leaving behind traces that suggest wide environmental tolerance. Other archaic populations likely persisted in isolated pockets. their identities still partially obscured by the limits of the fossil record. These encounters are not uniform across time or space. In some regions, populations may have coexisted for thousands of years with limited interaction. In others, they may have overlapped briefly before one group retreated, merged, or disappeared. The archaeological record does not preserve direct evidence of social relationships in most cases, but genetic data confirms that interaction did occur. Small percentages of archaic DNA in modern human populations point to episodes of interbreeding that left a lasting biological legacy. What makes these encounters particularly significant is that they occur during a period of environmental instability. Climate fluctuations repeatedly reshape the boundaries of habitable zones. Ice advances push populations southward. Warmer intervals allow re-expansion into previously abandoned regions. In this shifting environment, different human groups are often forced into closer proximity than they might otherwise have experienced. These overlapping zones of habitation create conditions where interaction becomes more likely, even if not constant. Shared use of river valleys, coastal corridors, and resource-rich refugia increases the probability of contact. Yet the nature of these interactions remains uncertain. They may have ranged from avoidance and competition to occasional cooperation and exchange. Neanderthals, for example, show evidence of complex behavior, including tool production, use of fire, and possible symbolic practices. Their survival strategies are well adapted to cold environments, relying heavily on large game hunting and efficient use of available resources. Homo sapiens, by contrast, exhibit greater flexibility in diet and technology, allowing them to occupy a wider range of ecological niches. These differences may have shaped how the two groups interacted when their ranges overlapped. In some regions, archaeological sites suggest gradual replacement of Neanderthal populations by Homo sapiens over thousands of years. This process does not appear to be sudden or uniform. Instead, it likely involved a combination of factors, including competition for resources, demographic differences, and environmental pressures. In other regions, evidence of coexistence persists for extended periods, suggesting that interaction was complex and variable. Denisovan influence is more difficult to trace directly, but genetic evidence indicates that their legacy survives in modern populations, particularly in parts of Asia and Oceania. This suggests that Homo sapiens not only encountered these groups, but also integrated with them to some extent. The sparse fossil record makes it difficult to reconstruct the full nature of these interactions, but the genetic imprint is unmistakable. What is especially important in this period is that human expansion is no longer a singular narrative of movement from one origin point outward. Instead, it becomes a multi-layered process of overlapping dispersals, interactions, and replacements. Different human groups move through the same landscapes at different times, leaving behind intersecting traces of occupation. Environmental change continues to play a central role in shaping these dynamics. As climates fluctuate, the boundaries between populations shift repeatedly. In some periods, regions become isolated refuges where small populations survive in relative separation. In others, expanding habitable zones bring groups back into contact. These cycles of separation and reconnection shape the genetic and cultural complexity of later human populations. There is also evidence that cultural exchange may have occurred, even if sporadically. Certain technological similarities across different human groups suggest either independent invention under similar environmental pressures or limited transmission of ideas. Determining which of these explanations applies in each case remains a subject of ongoing research. What is clear is that the boundaries between groups were not always rigid. Over time, however, Homo sapiens become the only surviving human lineage. The reasons for this are still debated and likely involve multiple interacting factors. Greater demographic resilience, broader ecological adaptability, and complex social networks may have contributed to their long-term success. Yet the disappearance of other human groups is not simply a story of replacement. It is also a story of integration, where traces of these populations persist within the genetic makeup of modern humans. This period marks a profound transformation in the nature of human journeys across the world. Movement is no longer only about leaving a homeland behind. It becomes a process of encountering other forms of humanity, each shaped by different histories of adaptation and survival. The empty lands crossed by early humans are not truly empty. They are layered with the presence of multiple human worlds, overlapping in time and space. As Homo sapiens continue to expand, they carry within them not only their own lineage, but fragments of others. The journey across continents becomes, in a sense, a journey through a broader human landscape that is gradually narrowing but still richly diverse. And within this complexity, the foundations of the modern human world are quietly taking shape. Long before history becomes written, it exists only as memory fragile, shifting, and carried in the minds of those who have no way to preserve it beyond speech, gesture, and repetition. In this world, where early humans move across vast and changing landscapes, memory is not a luxury, it is survival. To forget a water source is to risk death. To forget a seasonal route is to lose access to food. To forget the warning embedded in an old story is to walk unknowingly into danger. As human groups expand across continents, the need to transmit knowledge over distance and time becomes increasingly important. The landscapes they traverse are too large, too variable, and too unpredictable to be mastered by individual experience alone. Instead, survival depends on shared memory knowledge accumulated across generations and refined through repetition. This is where early storytelling begins to take shape, not as entertainment, but as structure. Stories function as compressed environmental maps. They carry information about migration routes, seasonal changes, dangerous territories, and resource locations. A narrative about a failed hunt is also a lesson in animal behavior. A story about a vanished group is also a warning about environmental risk. Even mythological elements, where they appear, often sit on top of real ecological observations encoded in symbolic form. What makes this system powerful is its flexibility. Unlike fixed records, oral traditions can adapt as environments change. A route that becomes unreliable can be removed from memory. A new source of water can be incorporated into existing narratives. Over time, these stories become layered, with older and newer knowledge coexisting in the same narrative structures. Some researchers suggest that during periods of long-distance dispersal, oral traditions may have played a crucial role in maintaining coherence across widely separated groups. Even when populations became geographically isolated, shared narrative structures may have preserved a sense of connection to ancestral origins. These connections were not historical in the modern sense, but functional, guiding behavior and reinforcing social identity. At the same time, storytelling is not purely informational, it is also emotional and social. Shared narratives reinforce group cohesion, especially in environments where survival depends on cooperation. Stories about past journeys, dangers overcome, or lost places help maintain trust within groups facing uncertain futures. In this way, memory becomes not only a tool for navigation, but a foundation for social stability. There is also evidence that certain recurring motifs in later mythologies may have roots in these deep prehistoric experiences. Themes of long journeys, lost homelands, great floods, harsh deserts, and distant ancestral lands appear across widely separated cultures. While it is not possible to directly trace these stories back to specific prehistoric events, their persistence suggests that they may reflect long-standing human experiences of movement, environmental change, and displacement. Importantly, these early narrative systems operate without written language. This means that information is preserved through repetition, variation, and communal reinforcement. Each telling is slightly different, but the core structure remains stable enough to transmit essential knowledge across generations. In this way, storytelling becomes a dynamic archive, constantly updated yet anchored in shared experience. As humans move into more diverse and distant environments, the role of memory becomes even more critical. New landscapes require rapid learning, and stories help bridge the gap between unfamiliar conditions and inherited knowledge. A group entering a new region may rely on narrative frameworks to interpret unfamiliar signals, reading animal behavior, weather patterns, or terrain features through the lens of past experience encoded in story. However, this system has limitations. Memory is vulnerable to distortion over time. As groups become more separated, stories can diverge significantly, leading to variations in understanding of the same ancestral knowledge. What begins as a shared narrative foundation can gradually evolve into distinct cultural traditions, shaped by local environments and experiences. Despite these variations, the underlying function remains consistent to support survival across space and time. In this sense, early storytelling is not separate from migration, it is part of it. Movement across empty lands is made possible not only by physical endurance, but by the ability to carry knowledge across those distances in symbolic form. As populations continue to spread, these narrative systems grow more complex. They begin to incorporate not only practical survival knowledge, but also explanations for natural phenomena, social structures, and the origins of the group itself. The world is interpreted through layered stories that blend observation with meaning. In the absence of written records, these oral systems become the only way to preserve continuity across generations. They allow groups separated by distance to remain intellectually and culturally connected, even when physical contact is no longer possible. And within this evolving system of memory and movement, something profound emerges. Humans are no longer simply traveling through space. They are carrying versions of the world within them constructed from experience, refined through repetition, and shaped by the need to survive in environments that are constantly changing. The empty lands they cross are not truly silent. They are filled with remembered voices, inherited knowledge, and stories that continue to guide movement long after the original events have faded into time. In the long stretch of human expansion across unfamiliar landscapes, survival increasingly depends not only on knowledge of where to go, but on the tools that make going possible in the first place. Movement across empty lands is never just a matter of walking. It is a technological achievement, built gradually through countless small innovations that reshape what the human body can endure and what environments it can cross. Fire is among the earliest and most transformative of these technologies. It is not merely a source of warmth, but a portable extension of environmental control. In cold regions, it prevents exposure from becoming fatal. In dark landscapes, it extends the usable hours of the day. In unfamiliar territories, it provides protection from predators and a stable point of orientation in otherwise disorienting environments. Fire does not eliminate risk. but it changes its terms. As humans move into more varied climates, clothing becomes another critical adaptation. Simple coverings evolve from occasional protection into structured systems designed to regulate temperature across extreme conditions. In colder regions, layered materials allow groups to retain heat and expand their range into environments that would otherwise be uninhabitable. In warmer zones, lighter adaptations help manage heat stress while maintaining protection from sun, insects, and environmental hazards. Clothing, in this sense, becomes an interface between the body and the world, allowing humans to inhabit a wider range of landscapes without biological change. Tools, too, undergo continuous refinement. Early stone technologies gradually evolve into more specialized forms, adapted to different ecological tasks. Cutting tools become more precise. Hunting implements become more efficient. Scraping and processing tools allow greater use of animal carcasses and plant resources. These developments are not isolated inventions, but cumulative improvements shaped by repeated interaction with diverse environments. One of the most important technological shifts in this period is the increasing portability of toolkits. Instead of relying on locally available raw materials alone, groups begin to carry carefully selected tools across long distances. This reduces dependence on immediate geological conditions and allows for greater flexibility in movement. A group no longer needs to locate suitable stone sources before settling in a new region. They arrive already equipped with the means to adapt. Fire, clothing, and portable tools together form a system that fundamentally alters the limits of human mobility. They reduce vulnerability to environmental extremes and expand the range of habitable conditions. But equally important is what they represent: a growing separation between human survival and immediate environmental constraint. Humans are no longer fully dependent on the conditions of a single location. They carry modified environments with them. This technological buffering has profound consequences for expansion. It allows humans to enter regions that would otherwise be inaccessible: colder latitudes, drier interiors, higher altitudes. Each of these environments presents unique challenges, but none are entirely prohibitive when supported by appropriate technology and knowledge. Over time, this enables a gradual widening of the human ecological range. However, technology alone does not determine success. Its effectiveness depends on accumulated knowledge of how and when to use it. Fire must be maintained and transported under variable conditions. Clothing must be adapted to different climates. Tools must be repaired, replaced, and modified as resources change. Technology in this context is not static. It is a continuous practice. Archaeological evidence suggests that technological innovation often accelerates during periods of environmental instability. When climates shift rapidly, groups that can adapt their tools and techniques quickly are more likely to survive and expand. This creates a feedback loop in which environmental pressure drives innovation, and innovation in turn enables further expansion into challenging environments. Another important aspect of this technological development is its social dimension. Knowledge of tool production, fire management, and material selection is transmitted across generations. This transmission is not uniform. Some groups develop highly specialized techniques adapted to local environments, while others maintain more generalized systems suited for mobility. This diversity of technological approaches reflects the varied conditions encountered during expansion. As humans move farther across continents, their technologies also begin to diverge regionally. Different environments favor different adaptations. Coastal groups develop tools suited for marine resources. Inland groups refine hunting technologies for large terrestrial animals. Cold region populations emphasize insulation and fire efficiency. These regional variations are not isolated inventions but responses to shared challenges in different contexts. Despite this diversity, a common underlying pattern persists. Technology increasingly serves to extend human presence beyond natural biological limits. It allows survival in environments that would otherwise be marginal or inaccessible. In this sense, technology becomes a form of ecological expansion, enabling humans to occupy a wider range of the planet than any other large mammal. Yet even with these advances, movement across empty lands remains uncertain. Tools can fail, fire can be lost, clothing can degrade, knowledge can be forgotten or misapplied. Technological advantage reduces risk, but does not eliminate it. Every journey still involves exposure to environments that cannot be fully controlled. What emerges from this interplay of innovation and uncertainty is a new kind of relationship between humans and space. Distance is no longer defined solely by physical endurance. It is shaped by technological capacity and accumulated knowledge. The further these systems develop, the more the effective size of the habitable world expands. In this way, the empty lands of the ancient world become progressively less empty, not because they are filled with more life, but because humans become increasingly capable of inhabiting them. What once acted as barriers begin to transform into traversable spaces, reshaped by tools, fire, clothing, and the growing sophistication of human adaptation. And within this transformation, the foundation is laid for something unprecedented in the history of life on Earth, a species capable of carrying its environment with it, extending its reach far beyond the limits of biology alone. There comes a point in the long arc of human movement where expansion is no longer a series of isolated departures, but a slow saturation of the planet's habitable zones. The journeys that once seemed exceptional, rare crossings of difficult terrain, cautious entries into unfamiliar environments gradually accumulate into a broader pattern. Humans are no longer confined to a single ecological heartland. They are present across vast and varied regions of the Earth, each occupied in different ways, each shaped by different pressures, but all connected by a shared origin of movement. This spread is not uniform, and it is not immediate. It unfolds over tens of thousands of years through repeated waves of dispersal, local adaptation, and occasional retreat. Some regions are occupied early and continuously. Others are entered, abandoned, and re-entered multiple times as climate conditions shift. The result is a complex mosaic of human presence that reflects both opportunity and constraint. Across Eurasia, human populations gradually extend into diverse environments: temperate forests, open steppe, high-altitude plateaus, and cold northern latitudes. Each of these zones demands different survival strategies, and over time, human groups adapt accordingly. In some regions, mobility remains high, with seasonal movement structured around resource cycles. In others, more stable settlement patterns begin to emerge where environmental conditions allow. Australia represents one of the earliest major expansions beyond the combined African and Eurasian ecological systems, requiring significant open water crossings and adaptation to entirely new ecosystems. Its early occupation demonstrates not only physical capability but also planning, coordination, and technological readiness for environments that differ sharply from those previously encountered. Later, much farther in time, human groups enter the Americas, likely through northern routes shaped by glacial conditions that temporarily expose land bridges or narrow passages between continents. These movements occur in pulses, influenced by shifting climates and changing landscapes. Once inside these vast new land masses, humans rapidly spread across a wide range of environments, from Arctic tundra to tropical forests, demonstrating a remarkable flexibility in ecological adaptation. What is striking in this global expansion is not just the speed in geological terms, but the consistency of underlying behavior. Everywhere humans go, they follow a familiar pattern: initial exploration, gradual familiarization, adaptation to local conditions, and eventual establishment of stable patterns of movement or settlement. Even in radically different environments, the underlying logic of survival remains recognizable. At the same time, the world that humans are entering is not static. It is still undergoing significant climatic fluctuations. Ice ages continue to reshape coastlines and expose or submerge land connections. Rivers shift their courses, deserts expand and contract. Forests migrate in response to temperature and rainfall changes. Human expansion does not occur in a stable world, but in one that is continuously rearranging its own structure. This dynamic environment means that human presence is never fully secure. Regions that are habitable at one time may become marginal later. Populations may retreat from certain areas only to return when conditions improve. In some cases, entire regions experience cycles of occupation and abandonment that span millennia. Human geography becomes deeply entangled with climatic rhythms. As populations spread, cultural diversity increases. Isolated groups develop distinct languages, technologies, and social structures. Yet beneath this diversity, there remains a shared foundation of behavioral flexibility, the ability to adapt to new environments, to modify tools and strategies, and to maintain mobility under changing conditions remains a defining feature across all regions. One of the more subtle consequences of this global dispersal is the gradual transformation of human identity. As groups become geographically separated, their experiences of the world diverge. A group living in Arctic conditions develops a very different relationship with landscape and survival than a group in tropical forests or arid interiors. Yet all remain connected by distant common ancestry and similar adaptive capacities. Despite this divergence, there are also moments of reconnection. As climate shifts bring populations into closer contact, ideas, technologies, and genetic material can spread between previously isolated groups. These interactions contribute to the complexity of human development, creating layers of exchange that are difficult to reconstruct in detail, but evident in archaeological and genetic records. By this stage, humans have effectively become a global species. Their presence extends across most habitable regions of the planet, shaped by continuous adaptation to environmental variation. What began as localized movement within a single continent has become a widespread pattern of occupation across multiple land masses. Yet even in this global presence, as the fundamental condition remains unchanged, human survival still depends on movement, adaptation, and the ability to respond to environmental uncertainty. The empty lands of the past are no longer empty in the same way, but the principle that shaped their crossing remains embedded in human behavior. Expansion has not eliminated uncertainty. It has simply distributed it across a larger world. And within this expanded world, the legacy of those first journeys continues to shape every path that follows. By the time humans occupy most of the planet's habitable regions, the long process of movement across empty lands has already dissolved into something less visible. There is no single moment that marks completion, no final crossing, no definitive arrival. Instead, there is gradual fading of frontier space, as more and more regions become part of human experience. What once felt like vast separation between inhabited zones becomes a continuous web of presence. Yet even at this point of global distribution, the memory of emptiness remains embedded in the structure of human behavior. The species that now spans continents was shaped by landscapes that were never guaranteed, never stable, and never fully known in advance. Every region once had to be approached without certainty. Every environment once required interpretation before it could be lived in. This legacy does not disappear. It becomes part of how humans continue to engage with the world. Across this expanded world, movement remains fundamental. Even when populations settle in relatively stable environments, the underlying capacity for mobility persists. Seasonal migrations, trade routes, resource tracking, and later, long-distance exploration continue to reflect the same ancient logic. Survival improves when space is not treated as fixed, but as something that can be traversed, reinterpreted, and reoccupied. The vast empty lands that once separated groups are now transformed into interconnected landscapes of human activity. Rivers that once guided small groups now anchor entire civilizations. Coastal routes that once offered survival pathways now support large-scale exchange networks. Even deserts, steppes, and high latitudes, once barriers of extreme difficulty, become integrated into broader patterns of human use and understanding. But the deeper transformation is not only geographic, it is cognitive. The human mind, shaped over hundreds of thousands of years of movement, now carries an inherited expectation that the world is larger than the immediate experience. Distance is no longer intimidating in the way it once was. It is structured, measurable, and conceptually navigable. This ability is not a modern invention alone. It is the outcome of countless generations crossing environments where survival required thinking beyond the visible horizon. Still, the history of those early journeys is never fully recoverable. Archaeology can trace fragments, genetics can outline pathways, environmental science can reconstruct ancient corridors, but the lived experience of crossing those empty lands, of moving through regions without certainty, without maps, without assurance of return, remains inaccessible. It exists only as implication, written indirectly into the structure of who humans are today. In that sense, the world is not simply something that humans came to occupy. It is something they learned to read through movement. Every landscape once had to be interpreted step by step. Every distance once had to be earned through endurance. And every expansion carried with it the quiet risk of not continuing at all. As modern humans look across a planet fully mapped and densely interconnected, it is easy to overlook how recently this condition emerged in deep time. The global world is new. The capacity that made it possible is ancient. It was built not in moments of conquest or arrival, but in the slow, repeated act of crossing spaces that offered no guarantee of survival. The first human journeys across empty lands were never just about reaching new territory. They were about learning that the world could be crossed at all, that space, no matter how vast, was not absolute boundary but negotiable distance. That survival could extend beyond the familiar, even when familiarity was the only certainty available. And once that realization became part of human experience, nothing about the relationship between people and the earth could remain the same. In the end, what remains is not a map of where humans went, but a deeper inheritance, the knowledge that movement is possible even when the world appears empty, and that every horizon, no matter how distant, is part of a landscape that can eventually be walked,